So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Philip Phillips. I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College, and I welcome all of you here today to our Honors Lecture Series on Native American culture. Pleased to have our very own Dean, Dr. John Weil, with us today. And those of you who are visiting, we welcome you and hope that you'll come back to hear some of the other presentations in the series. We've got a really rich lineup this semester, so it should be a lot of fun. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, who comes to us from the Department of Human Sciences, and someone who is a member of the honors faculty here at MTSU. Lauren Rudd has a very diverse educational background. She earned a BFA in art at the University of Memphis, an MS in industrial studies with a computer-aided design emphasis from MTSU, and an EDD in leadership and professional practice at Trevecca Nazarene University. So she's clearly someone who loves learning and has a very rich and diverse background. She teaches in textiles, merchandising, and design, which is a program area in human sciences here at MTSU. She teaches the courses in computer-aided design, fashion illustration, design fundamentals, and is teaching a new and improved course in social aspects of clothing, behind the cloth, saris, and veiling this summer. I think it's a fascinating course. I've looked at the course proposal. We've talked about it. So those of you who are interested in that, please give it a look. I think it'll be fascinating. This course will have approval for honors credit, EXL credit, global studies credit, and possibly women's studies credit. Dr. Rudd is currently enjoying research in several areas. One area of interest includes baby boomer women. She's working with undergraduate students, developing styling advice for mature female bodies using data from the 3D body scanner. And she's also working with Dr. Helen Binkley, investigating the effects of aquatic exercise and styling advice on general health, body image, and life satisfaction. Dr. Rudd is also a quilter and a fiber artist, and is interested in all aspects of cultural fiber arts. This led to the development of the saris and veiling class mentioned before, and also to this presentation on Native American dress. Dr. Rudd does not profess to be an expert on the subject of Native American dress, but she is interested and always ready to learn and share new information with others to encourage new ideas, new ways of thinking, and how that information can apply to you. She's very adaptable and actually produced this talk at my request. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rudd today.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. And again, I'm not the expert, but I have learned a lot, and I have prepared something that I hope is interesting for you all today to think about. All right, so Native American dress, we need to look at what do we think it is? When you think about Native American or American Indian dress, what does the history show? Where do we see it? Where do we find it? Where, we don't see anybody in here dressed in any kind of regalia. And then what is fashion doing about it? This works. All right, so to start off, when I started looking at this, I thought, well, let's look at southeastern Native American tribes and let's focus on that. And so what I found from the federal website was that there are 10 tribes that are federally recognized in the southeast. And then there are state recognition. The state recognized tribes don't necessarily get federal funding. There are 9 in Alabama. There's 1 in Georgia, 10 in Louisiana, 8 in North Carolina, 7 in South Carolina, 11 in Virginia, and none in Tennessee. All right, so there are no federally recognized tribes nor state recognized tribes in Tennessee. Maybe that's some of the reason that we don't see anything or learn much about it in our school growing up. All right, I don't know, maybe today you all did, but I didn't learn much. Okay, so what is Native American dress? What do they wear? And so we all have some preconceived ideas of what this might be, some notions, and we got those maybe from cowboys and Indians and old Western movies, or maybe Pocahontas from Disney, and Halloween costumes. All right, so those are some ideas, and here are some pictures that are here, and we might notice a few things that are maybe insensitive that are going on there. We'll talk about that in a minute. So here is on polyvore.com is this really wonderful website that our students use to do styling. They can pull together outfits and clothes, and then you can also order them on there and things like that. But this is an example of what's going on in fashion today with Native American, Native Indian, or American Indian, Native American inspirations. And here we see a woman in a full regalia headdress. Women don't wear those, by the way. Okay, and here are some more examples from Polyvore with Pocahontas. I just Googled Pocahontas I didn't. I searched it in Polyvore and came up with a lot of ensembles that resemble what Pocahontas looked like in the movie. Later on, I'll show you a picture of Pocahontas. And then we have Halloween costumes. And, yeah, they don't need any more comment. So why do we wear clothing? When we study clothing, it's important to look at it, why we wear it. And we wear it for protection, right? Modesty, identity, self-expression, and cultural expression are a part of that identity. But all of our clothing, everything that we wear is conditioned by our environment and our region, also our culture, of course. But where it's cold, we wear cold weather clothes, and where it's warm, we wear warm weather clothes. Okay, so a brief history of Native American. They actually, in the research, it shows that they prefer to be called American Indians in most research sources. And look at their dress. So the earliest people wore very few clothing. We have records from the first white people that came over here, that a lot of commentary about how they didn't wear very many clothes. They did protect their body by red ochre, which is a combination of a mineral, and they mixed it with animal fat to create a protection from the skin, like we use zinc oxide today sometimes. And then that red ochre became adapted to become body ornament and body paint, and later on tattooing, and then also became an indicator of vanity or status. And then that adornment was moved on into garments. Right? The way back anthropological research shows that they think that as the Ice Age receded, that the migration was northward, and then that required fitted clothing in the colder regions, so those people started wearing more clothing. Again, I'm not an anthropologist either. So this is red ochre. It's a pigment that is found in nature, and it can be mixed with fat again, and it was used a lot as a body paint, and it's still used all over Africa, and the Aborigines also use it as a body paint. And this is a drawing from the 1500s of a native in body paint that was primarily red ochre. All right, body paint is still being done. The two black and white pictures are examples of Cherokee tattooing. That was very early that the explorers found here. Most of the colored images here are current images from a powwow, and then this is a painting from the early 1800s. And face paint is regional and marked by tribe, and it has different meanings. That's not what this presentation is about today, but this is a really great example of some of the different meanings of face paint. And then when we talked about migrating to needing clothes, here we have, we couldn't not include the Eskimos and their lovely warm weather clothing, right? Because to keep out the weather, they learned to tailor clothing more so than wrapped, and we'll look at that in a minute from some more pictures. All right, clothing gender differences developed through community roles. Men were primarily considered hunters and takers of life, and women were fertile and did more of the planting, and they were considered the source of life. And the clothing shows these differences in the decoration, the function, and the spiritual representation in it. So here's a picture of just some women in a traditional role of sewing. This is a group together sewing, and if you look at the background, you see a lot of clothing hung in the background. And this is probably, it didn't say that it was, but it's probably a group of women working in a situation where they are selling the garments to tourists for income as an economic resource. Right? Here are the gentlemen acting as a hunting party. This is an old image that was found. So they went out to hunt, but they did also work together. But a lot of times these were segregated roles where this is a very old an engraving from the late 1500s where women were planting and the men were preparing the field for planting. You see this also indicates, and this was in Florida, so it indicates that they weren't wearing a lot of clothing. It wasn't about modesty, it was more about function. So when we look at Native clothing, we look at their informal or formal dress, how they wore clothes, right? As early as the 1700s, everyday dress was traditional, just like, you know, we come to class usually in our blue jeans and a t-shirt, or we walk around all summer in shorts and a t-shirt, right? That was the kind of, they had work clothes that they wore. Daily wear was more appropriate for that work. And they didn't always wear a lot of clothing. Regalia was reserved for special spiritual celebrations, and they only used full dress here during visits to white settlements. What this is talking about is you saw those the Indians from Florida who were scantily dressed, but because the Europeans got so upset about it, the Christians, mostly Christians, they got so upset about the modesty factor of them walking around without a lot of clothes on that when they went to visit the white settlements, they would always cover up. So that was really interesting to respect their ideas. This is, I found a great website that talked a lot about the southeastern area, Native Americans. And this beginning page was the tunicas. And you see again here, the women always wore skirts. So whenever you see anything that says they weren't clothed, the women were always covered with a skirt. Throughout anthropological research shows that that's what they think. And then a breechclout or a breechcloth is what the men primarily wore, particularly where it was hot. And then this is Pocahontas in this picture. Now the picture is not a photograph, right? It is a sketch, a drawing, and there's Pocahontas, and she is in the typical garb of only having one breast covered and one shoulder, holding her clothes up. And then there's another formal picture of her in a full buckskin dress. And here's a situation that really exemplifies the idea that at home we would wear, you know, our hat and our clothes. The natives did adopt European dress pretty early on, and so they would wear that. And then within the tribe, they often wore their traditional clothing. But the big full war bonnet was was reserved only for special occasions, special ceremonies. This is another example. The top picture is not very well focused, but it is the same tribe, or the Osage, and in the same time period. And you see that in their tribe, they wear their cultural dress, and then when they are working with the whites, they would dress in a more white, conservative type dress. All right. So when we look at the European influences on their dress, there were a lot, and then American Indians were really open to that. So they were open to new ideas and goods. They liked the idea of pre-woven cloth. They did weave their own cloth before the Europeans came here, but it's very time consuming because you have to grow the fiber, you know, separate the fibers, spin it into threads, and then weave it. before you can make clothes out of it. Right? They love the beads and the silver ornamentation. Also, coins were used for that. They extracted some of the elements of European folk art, particularly applique and embroidery, and the whole idea of tailoring the clothes instead of wrapping clothing came from the Europeans. As we know, the Europeans came in and moved the Indians off their land, and so they lost their subsistence way of life, and that created an economic need. And so as early as the 1700s, they began to use their creativity to serve tourism because they needed the income from that. And they needed to be able to trade also to get goods because they couldn't necessarily grow them themselves or whatever. And then their traditional costumes then served to maintain an identity separate from that dominant society that was taking over their world. All right, their artistic expression was cultural and personal, both. Art was always a part of functional objects. It was they never used art for art's sake. That's a modern thought of the 20th century. The crafts were made by people of both genders, and depending on what they made and what they needed, determined the gender. But clothing was made primarily by women. And then when we talk about these people, the Native American people, the tribal units were divided into cultural areas by economy, social organization, their religious views, their historical experiences. And what this is talking about is that different regions would have similarities. They were not necessarily all the same, but they were more similar, and so it's divided into regions. Now, an interesting thing that happened through this whole result of making things for tourists was that the colonial European elite, they thought that the Indian artifacts were really cool, right? Those were noble, symbols of the noble and natural life. There was something that was like, you know, these are really special, and they did respect them, but they also wanted to collect them, right? And what happened is that's a really good thing because that helped to preserve their cultures and their history. And a lot of these objects are now in museums, but very many are still in private collections. About 20 years ago, the museums put on a big push to try and encourage people who had some of these artifacts in their private collections to share them and to get them back to the Native people. Even if they were in museums, they would be representative of those people. All right, two of the biggest, when you're talking about museums, you have to look at the Smithsonian because they have a whole museum on the American Indian. Right? They also, that is in Washington, D.C., and very interesting architecture. And they also have a branch at the U.S. Customs House in New York City. If you go into these museums, and I've been to the one in D.C., and they have really awesome exhibits. They're curated, there's great information, there's wonderful pictures. You can see that. It's the American Indian, so it's North and South and Mesoamerica. It's not just North American, right? But when you look online, oh my goodness, here's what you get. Oh, that's interesting. That's some kind of a headdress. Oh, there's a headdress, three of them. Not so interesting, very academic. The interesting thing about this headdress is this red part. Those are woodpecker skulls, like scalps, with red woodpecker heads, all with their fur. Kind of interesting. And then this was like the most exciting exhibit from the pages online. So because they had shown it in one of the exhibits, then they actually had some nicer pictures, but very, very flat and dull. What was interesting are these little cards, and there's one a little bit later. These little cards are the original cards, and this is what's all in the computer now. So the information is much drier now than it used to be. So this says collected from Medicine Chief Mikasuki, right? And so it doesn't really say a whole lot, just formerly owned by and acquired. And there's one later that's really interesting. So that's a really dry way to study this. But if you're interested, you can study it through photos. Now, a lot of these that are coming up right away are from the Northwest, different tribes in the Northwest. Here's the Chilkat. And you can see that they used blankets. So here you can see where they used blankets that were wrapped, heavily decorated and wrapped. And a lot of their clothing, even though some of it is fitted, a lot of it was a draped type garment. These are also from the Northwest Indians, and you can see how different they look from the people before them. And you can see the face paint and the piercings were common in some tribes. Her crown is made of bear claws, and bear claws were very, very significant in that it showed the power of the bear, and mostly related to power, but other things too. Right, and here's another picture of and you can see his hat, right? And that hat style was from the Northwest Indians. We can deduce was to keep the rain off partially. I mean, it was also significant, but it rains up there in Washington a lot and in that area. The picture on the other side is a current picture. And so they still use this symbolism, and they still dress this way today, very similar to that. So it's really interesting. Here's some different tribes, and we see some particular interesting things. This is an otter fur headband that was very common, and these are also bear claws. So if you think, I don't know, maybe 16 claws per bear, or maybe 20. I don't know how many if they use a thumb claw. But so that's a lot of bears. Right? And then we have here this breastplate is made out of bone, and it's used to protect them from arrows and things that might be hitting them in the front. It was used also as regalia and decorative. And you see the lone standing up feather. The feathers were eagle feathers, primarily golden eagles, more so than bald eagles. And they also used turkey feathers. Today, eagle feathers are protected, and if an Indian wants to have an eagle feather, own an eagle feather, they have to get permission from the government to do so. And permission is not easily granted. It's pretty well regulated. In order, they have to register, they have to show that they're with a registered tribe, and fill out all kinds of forms in order to obtain permission of an eagle feather. A lot of these are handed down too. Some interesting pictures. Here's a woman in a very simple, common dress, and her little baby too. Sadly, that baby, I left that in there because we got to have a little tug on our heartstrings. But this is 1915, so pretty early. And then we see a chief in a full war bonnet, or a longer war bonnet, not the full all the way trailing. But again, these were reserved for special occasions and not everyday wear at all. And a couple of more women who are wearing, this is a buckskin dress, and I have an interesting picture later that shows kind of how those were made. And then this is a different, she's wrapped in a cloth blanket and a very interesting type of garment around her neck. And the moccasins are all nicely decorated. There's a lot of ornamentation that goes on in their clothing. This is a full warrior headdress. And here's one that's shorter, that's stuck up, so they were different. Again, we see the bear claws. We see the symbolism and in their garments. Here is a picture of some people that are more European type dress, but again, they're still wearing a wrap skirt, the women are, and he is also wearing a cloak that is a wrap garment. This is actually a piece of a plaid fabric that looks like it might have been a Pendleton wool, and this is 1890, so pretty early. And then this is the same dude here in a different outfit. And then this is one of his wives. This is one of these wives, so it's much a later picture, and you can see she's in European dress in that picture. So they did adopt the European dress a lot. This is a guy with his wife and sister. And again, you can see a lot of influence from the Europeans. This is a plaid plaid fabric and a floral fabric. They did not make floral fabric. This is a more native type of weaving, so that was more traditional versus adopting what they could get from the Europeans. And so you see some of that going on. The same thing here, you see she has, her blanket is probably woven in the tribe, and then she has on a calico printed dress. And some other examples with some ornamentation that is going on his clothing here. This is a turkey feather around the neck, and probably turkey feathers in his headdress also. And then here is an example of a family that is dressed in non-Indian dress, as the headline put it. And another example, Sam Folsom was an important Choctaw, and he was dressed to go meet with the government in European clothing, right? The interesting thing in this source, and it was in many sources, is that the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw Creek, and the Seminole, the southeast area tribes, were considered by the whites as the 5 civilized tribes. The reason for that being that primarily their form of government was very similar to a European form of government, and so they considered that civilized. We also have a picture of Sequoia. His home is in East Tennessee, and he developed a syllabary, a way of writing down the Cherokee language so that they could translate and communicate with the whites better. And then we have a Cherokee medicine man. And even though he was a medicine man, here he is dressed in European clothing. Interesting. This is a Cherokee lacrosse event with celebrations that would happen in accordance, but you can see that the women are dressed in very normal looking long dresses. And they're not anything looking spectacular. You can also see from this that these young men are not wearing leggings, as we'll see in a second, but they're wearing real shorts. And this is 1889, so before the turn of the century. But traditionally, they would wear a breechclout and leggings, right? And the way the breechclout worked, because I've always seen pictures like this and never really understood how that worked, was it was one cloth, or oftentimes used deer hide that was very, very soft. They would work it until the hide was extremely soft, and they would use that, tie it with a belt so that you can see how it would function. They also use that belt then to tie the leggings on. So here you can see the leggings, which wrapped around the inside of the leg and were usually seamed on the outside, and they also were tied onto the belt, and they weren't pants as we consider them today. They didn't have a crotch in them. And so the drawings also kind of show how those leggings were put together and how they attached. And here's another picture from the museum, from the Smithsonian, some pictures of some leggings. And these were made out of deer hide, and they attached up here. These are also deer hide, and you can see from the strings that they attached from here. These are made out of fabric, which is applique fabric, which was common to this tribe. And the pieces of fabric down here and at the top, so these are flipped, that's the part that would be tied into the waistband or belt. A traditional buckskin dress, this one was made with three buckskins, 3 skins. So there was one that went across the top, and then there was a different one that went down the front and down the back. But a lot of times they made the dress, it's pretty interesting, they would take a 2 deer skin dress, and they would put the deer head down. The head was not there, but they would leave the tail on to save as much of the leather as possible, and they would fold it and seam it at the shoulder line, but the tail would hang down right here in the middle, in the front and in the back. And on men's clothing, that tail then would hang at the bottom. They didn't put the tail at the top on men's clothing. They put it at the bottom. It's just interesting. Here's an example of a Seminole jacket from 1900 from the Smithsonian, and it also shows a chief wearing those similar clothes from that same period. And here's a family. The Seminoles used a different type of dress that was very common to, they used a type of seaming, which I'll show in another example. They wore long skirts. This is an example, and this was 1960, and actually the Seminoles are famous for this type, where all of these little patches are seamed in. They actually make strips and then cut the strips up and kind of shift them and sew them back together. So it's a really interesting process, but very bright and festive. This method for the Seminoles didn't come about until after the sewing machine came over here and they started using sewing machines. They did not do this when they were sewing by hand. They used applique. So this is a situation where another tribe uses applique of very geometric pieces, and they're also using applique here. This is your applique, which is taking a piece of fabric, folding the edges back, and then sewing it on top of another piece of fabric. This is a buckskin coat, believed to be Cherokee at the top. And very common was beading, and the beading was usually in this area, was reserved for shoulder sashes and belts. And here's some with very interesting, and you see the repetition of some of the symbolism with the scroll, and here we have a scroll and sun situation going on, and different kinds of geometric symbolism. Here are some more examples. The Seminoles didn't really use beading as much, but they used a type of finger weaving to create their sashes. And then this piece over here is a shoulder strap and a bag. And the red background fabric is actually something that you see from the card that was called strouting. And strouting came from England. It was a cheap fabric in England. It's a really thick, heavy fabric that they actually used to, when they dyed other fabric, they used it to absorb the extra dye. And they typically, when the English exported it to the U.S., they dyed it in either red or blue, and it's very common. The Indians really liked it because it was a really heavy kind of a felted fabric that they really liked. And here, these are from Texas, Kickapoo women in native dress, and you can see, for example, the long skirts, some of the wrapped clothing. Here we see this is wrapped around. These skirts were probably tied at the waist. And again, the last garment over there is also a wrapped garment. And here we see a lot of feather headdresses. Right? These are not common to our area. These are Plains Indians that wore the feather headdresses, and so they're not really common to this area. And this is Catawba Indians from South Carolina, and they did wear feathers, you see, but they didn't have the full war headdress, and their feathers stuck up as opposed to coming out. So when we look at American Indian dress today, we need to talk about the terminology because there are some terms that are considered, well, not preferential, and one of them is costume. It's an old term used in our industry to talk about any kind of dress as a people that they wore. We call it costume, or we also use dress, which is a more correct term. Clothing is just the object, so it's not really considered a term we use in research. But in Native American, American Indian type dress, regalia is really, really the preferred term used for their clothing today. And the regalia is commonly seen at powwows. It was worn especially for special dances. The dances are different. There are they're segmented into northern and southern. There are different dances that have different regalia, different costumes that they wear. And there are many variations then among those different dance regalia. These costumes / regalia, right, because it's hard to unuse a word you've been using for a long time, is very strong cultural historic ties. They pass these down. They inherit them from special people, not always related to them, and there's a lot of cultural significance in that. The powwows are really, really important intertribal social gathering functions, right? It's a way for them to stay connected to tribal cultures and identities. And you have to say, why is that important? Beyond just, keeping up with your identity, your culture, Well, a lot of the tribes are not allowed to marry within their own tribe. The people are not allowed to marry within their own tribe, and therefore, where are they going to meet people, unless other Native Americans, unless they get out there, right? And powwows actually serve as a meeting ground for those relationships. People form lifelong friendships, and there was a great video online where even the little kids, as young as 3 and 4, they would go to a powwow and see other friends that they made there, and they would only see them there, and maybe only 2 or 3 times a year, and they would go searching. As soon as they got there, they would searching out for their friends. So it's a really significant social occasion. And it's also a very significant lifestyle for the males. The males in the Native American culture have fallen into a lot of problems with alcohol and ending up in jail for different things, and several of them spoke out about how coming to the powwow and getting involved with their culture and the dress and everything, that it gave them something to focus on besides just feeling lost and feeling and turning to alcohol. And there were several who had used that as a way to have another focus in their life besides being unemployed and ending up in trouble. Also, when you're at the powwow, you don't stand out. You are among likes, and therefore you're not the only person there who's dressed up and looking fancy. These are bustles that are made primarily out of turkey feather. Again, some are made from eagle feather, and so this was an indoor powwow. They have a lot of powwows. I was amazed. The biggest one is called the Gathering of Nations, but they have a lot of local powwows. This one was in San Antonio, and several of these pictures came from here. This is a more common type of a headdress, way more so than the feathers. This is a special dance that they're doing here, and so the attire for this dress, this dance has a lot of, it's a traditional dance, has a lot of activity. And activity is part of the garment, so movement is a very significant part of some of these dances. And here's some more costumes we can see with the, some of this is beading, and there's some special beading in here, special belts. Here's another one of those bustles. And they have, like here are the dances. You can see the dances are very active. Here's a ribbon, this is a ribbon dance. This is another, this is actually, she was in the parade. And these are some little kids doing with the jingle dance costume. So in the parade, they would, at the biggest event, they would have a big parade, and everybody would come in their regalia and fully dressed and show off. And they're very proud of what they have. And these costumes are made, I apologize for using that term over and over. The jingles here, and there's another picture, I think. But the jingles actually were originally made from tins from tobacco, chewing tobacco tins. They actually make them another way now, but they would take that top out of the tobacco lid and twist it around and then put a piece of fabric, tie a knot on a piece of fabric inside of there, and then sew it to the dress. And they're used to not only make movement, but also sound. Here's the example of the jingle dress. So here's one not being shook, and here's one where someone is dancing, and you can see the significance of the movement and the noise. That's a northern style of dance. The southern women do not wear the jingle dress, and they don't make noise when they dance. And here, again, this is part of the parade from the Gathering of Nations. The Gathering of Nations powwow is one of the biggest ones that happens, and this one is coming up in April in, I believe it was Albuquerque, somewhere. I did find on the Smithsonian website that they held a powwow in 2004 in Iraq. They had a battalion of people who were from Oklahoma and in several different Native American tribes, and they created their clothing out of what they could find there, and they had their own powwow. And here they are in their military dress with their flags of nations. Here they are at the powwow. And they made their own drum also out of a 55-gallon drum and some bed parts, I think. The significance of the drum at the powwow is really, really powerful. If you've ever been to a powwow or if you're watching any YouTube videos, the drum is the heartbeat. It's the heartbeat of the community. And everything happens to this drum beat. And there are usually a number of drummers sitting around from like 5 to, it could be a really big drum with, 10 or 15 drummers around it, keeping the beat while the dancers dance. And the drum beat is their heartbeat. It represents the heartbeat, so it's really, really significant. All right, so let's look at fashion. So now that we've learned a little bit about Native American dress and seen a lot of pictures, right? So let's look at the influences from fashion. Right now, it's very trendy to use American Indian influences in fashion. Some of the ways it's being used with beading, the symbolism, the images, the patterns, the silhouette, and fringe and fur. Fur is really big right now, and I have some pictures to show that. So Balmain, Spring and Summer 15, so this is current, what's out in the stores coming out now. This is a lot of beading, very, very representative of what you saw earlier. KTZ came out with a collection just last week. So this is the Fall 15 collection. I'm going to flip through here really quickly. This is the designer here, or the design director here on the end. But I'm going to flip through these, and I want you to look at the Native American influences in here. This one is Northwest symbolism. It's hard to see from far away. A lot of fur, a lot of skins. These need no commentary. So there's a lot of controversy about this right now in the industry. And one of the people has a website who is very vocal about it. This woman has a doctorate, and she is very vocal about, and this is her website, Beyond Buckskin, about, hey, how can we do this? How can you use this without denigrating our culture? And she did not find this collection to be particularly lovely, let's put it that way. She found it kind of mildly offensive and also a knockoff of a Navajo or a Native American designer. In 2011, Parenza Schooler, her collection came out, and she actually did some homework, and she went to visit with the people and interviewed the Native American, looked at their history and their culture in the region, and incorporated those into some modest clothing, and didn't really just rip off everything that they did. And that was accepted by the Native Americans. There are some other fashion controversies that have come out recently. One of the most recent, Ralph Lauren came out with a line this Christmas. It was online, and it stayed up for, I don't know, maybe a week, and it was down. Got so much controversy. You cannot find it on the Ralph Lauren site anywhere. You can find it in some people's, you put something up on YouTube or anywhere else in social media, it's there to stay. And so I was able to find some pictures. And so here is Pharrell in his headdress, and that sparked a lot of backlash. Jeremy Scott did a line for Adidas. You can see the Northwest influence there. And the problem with this is disrespectful. Right? That's the problem. It's not that the images are there, but that they're so blatant and they're so disrespectful. And then Heidi Klum wearing a full warrior's headdress. Again, women never wear a full dress. Victoria's Secret in 2012 had this come down the runway and got a lot of controversy. This was the Ralph Lauren, one of the pictures from the Ralph Lauren that came across that. And then Outkast is that far back as 2004. This is part of what really started the controversy, was when they were at the Grammys gyrating in this clothing. Vogue magazine came out with these issues. These were international issues. And so here we have, from Russia and from Spain, different issues that came out in Vogue in 2011 also. This was one of the most blatant and the one that got a lot of press because Urban Outfitters used the term Navajo. Well, the Navajo have copyrighted their name, and you can't use their name with things that aren't Navajo, and you have to have permission from the Navajo Nation in order to use that term. And so they put these things online. They had 21 objects. This was in 2011 again. The problem with this, you see, is that here it provides a flagrant insensitivity to the high rates of things like sexual violence and alcoholism among the Native Americans. So I had to really search to find out what happened with this. I saw that the Navajo Nation sued them, and it was like, well, what happened? And so I actually found out that they finally, because Urban Outfitters fought this, but they finally took down this Navajo hipster panty type of commentary in here and called it a printed hipster panty. They didn't change the designs, but they did start to show a little bit more responsibility and respect for the Navajos. So what is this? It's a cultural appropriation. When you take something from another culture and you just rip it off in an insensitive manner. That's the problem, okay? Picking and choosing without their permission. And usually it's okay if you don't do it in an insensitive manner, right? And so it includes traditional knowledge, religious symbols, artifacts, other unauthorized use of the cultural practice and ideation. So why does this matter? So one quote from this is Jessica Metcalf, who runs the Beyond Buckskin website. She said that stop thinking of us as people when you see this. You just see this as stuff out there, or disrespectfully with Halloween and music videos and things, and you don't look at our lives and our identities and who we are. So examples of cultural appropriation to help you better understand would be a situation if you're not a member of the relevant culture wearing a Native American headdress. Obviously, that girl going down the runway in no clothes on Victoria's Secret, was not a Native American at all, and didn't have any business wearing a headdress, which is very, very culturally significant, right? Dressing up as a geisha or sombrero for Cinco de Mayo, and wearing a bindi when that's also become a fashion fad of wearing a bindi when you're not Southeast Asian Indian. So if we had dropped that Indian headdress symbolism and meaning as our own, then why is that a problem? There's been a growing protest against this cultural appropriation. They're outraged by this use of headdress in modern fashion by white people. Okay, and it's a spiritual desecration. You can see there was no respect in the way that was used at all, and social media has been all over that. We have social media to thank for that. All right, so what's the argument? How can you use it? So we have respect for our American friends, and this was actually some quotes I found online about their history and culture. They think that the outrage may be uncalled for if done right. So the cultural symbols can't necessarily be owned or exclusive to a right. We found that in this country more than anywhere, where you can feel like you can take anything that isn't trademarked. You can't take somebody else's logo, but you can't just make every single cultural symbol that you have into something that's copyrighted. And we live in a globalized society, and long time we've been sharing. I showed earlier where the Native Americans were sharing, and they were taking things from the European culture and using them, imbibing them into their own. So we may have some right to protest and right to freely choose. So how do we look at that? Right? So I think the key issue is respect. If we respect people, it makes a huge difference. We condemn acts of desecration on anybody's religious symbols. We shouldn't do that to anyone. And we look at those and we scorn those symbols. That becomes cultural appropriation. We need to use sensitivity with cultural exchange, especially in today's world. There's so much of it that's going on. And so if we are going to use a Native headdress, we need to think about what's behind that, the courage and bravery and hard work. Each one of those feathers is earned by acts of valor. And so they're not to be just considered a Halloween costume type situation. So if we look at it with a conscious and thoughtful manner, can it be done socially acceptable with cultural exchange and starting conversations between groups and among peoples? So one way that we can do this is supporting Native American designers. They're not on the runways, okay? There's not a lot of Native American runways, Native American designers working for big firms and coming down the runways. And so that's not where you find it. You find it, the actual dress, you can find them online at certain websites. You can find them at heritage events and powwows and different kinds of places. Also, the woman who has the Beyond the website, she has a list of designers. Right? And for instance, one of the Native American, a jewelry designer, had said that we put our good intentions into our work. We look forward to the person who will wear it. We do a prayer, a blessing for the wearer of the piece. We hope they'll accept this from their heart. All this teaching from their parents and from our family, we want to imbibe this into these objects. Because they have special meaning to us, we want them to have special meaning to you too. So can indigenous influence in fashion be okay? I don't know. How do you feel? Right? I'm not here to tell you this is right, this is wrong. I do have my own opinions about some of it, which probably came out. But there's no clear line, right? It's not clearly delineated. There's not, oh, you can get away with this and you can't, although there's a little bit of that. If you are of the culture, it's much more acceptable, right? What are the guidelines? What makes it okay, right? What makes it not okay? And what I wanted to, by showing you this, is I want you to be able to think about this. I want you to think and be respectful of other cultures, no matter what it is, whether it's Native American or anyone else. I want you to think about the significance to objects in that culture and what they may mean, and be respectful. And that's it, lots of it. Thank you.
Any quick questions?
Anybody have questions or comments? Did anybody learn anything or think about something new that they didn't know about? Oh, good. Yeah, I like those, yes.
That one piece that you're calling a traditional headpiece, that's called a roach?
Yes, and I forgot the term while I was talking. Yes, thank you. That is a roach, and it's very, very common. It's the most common headpiece, actually. Mm-hmm.
Back when I was in elementary school, every Thanksgiving we'd have like this little powwow thing where we would dress up. Some of us would dress up as like pioneers, and some of us would dress up as, well, not pioneers, settlers, some of us dressed up as Indians. And we would wear like sacks from like the grocery store and decorate them, which is like funny, like it was funny and I enjoyed it, but now like thinking back on it, like is that kind of like the start of, in a really young age, kind of like making it into like this costume thing where like it's all kind of like, there's no religious symbolism, it's just like a bag with decorations basically. You're like, that's basically what's in here.
And you have a point, but that's the question. Yeah. So how do we teach this? How do we imbibe this into our education and our white culture, this knowledge? How do we share that without and setting up stereotypes? Uh-huh.
I had something similar when I was in elementary school, but rather than having our teachers teach it to us, we actually invited people from a tribe. We were close to the Alabama border, so we had people from an Alabama tribe come and teach Indian culture on Thanksgiving. And that was a great way, I think, for elementary students to see it firsthand from a tribe member, exactly what they feel about their culture.
Right, that's excellent, and that's a great way to do it. But then you saw that there are no tribes in Tennessee, and those people are hard to flesh out. I tried that for this talk.
Okay, we are out of time, so thank you again for coming. If you have further questions, please feel free to come up and talk to Dr. Ryan.
Please.